Hi everyone, in this video we'll be getting into at conditionals. All right, you'll be amazed what you can do with at conditionals. Virtually all the services you have in your Spring Boot starters and the likes, they are all powered by at conditionals. Right, we'll be exploring a bit of at conditionals, some of the common use cases, and then I would show you in Spring Boot where most of these things are used. I'll just basically show you a class or two, and then you would then have good understanding of how it basically powers Spring Boot and know exactly how to make use of it in your application. All right, then, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, so this is the famous project we'll be working on, which is the Everything Spring Boot. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm basically going to create a new package with a new package and call it conditionals, right? Conditionals, okay, conditionals, okay. All right, so we have conditionals, and then I will go in and just create a quick configuration. I'll just basically call it, app config. All right, so label it add configuration. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. Add configuration. All right, so let's then dig in. Okay, so what I'm gonna do right here before actually doing this, okay, let me basically create something pretty cool here. So let's create okay, I labeled it at conditionals. Let's create this. So let's create something called Mac, or should I say Mac. Let me just work with okay, I just want to work with any OS that's basically available. Okay, let's call it Linux conditioners. We'll play around it, right? We'll play around it. So just call it Linux condition. All right, so we would implement condition, right? We implement condition, right? And after implementing condition, then we then basically move on. So it will be coming from Spring Boot condition. Come and click this and check where it's coming from. Yes, this is where I want it to pick. Yeah, condition. Okay, so I pick the condition. Then let's implement this. So the implementation would require us to have matches. What actually matches this? So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take this out and then give it something custom, right? I'm gonna give it something custom, and how that's gonna work is that I'm gonna say how that's gonna work. I'm gonna say, let's say string OS equals to system property. Thank you for this autocomplete. Then I'll say return if OS contains Linux, right? So I also want to make it, let's give it some extra things. OS is not equal to null, so we don't have the famous null pointer. No, and then have OS dot lowercase dot contains. Yeah, so I think this is basically what I want to do. So I'm going to check if the OS is not null, if it has this, and if it basically contains Linux. All right, so if it does, then I'll then come into my app config, then bring it in. Then I'm going to have a public string. I'll call it Linux bin. All right, so let's have this. So I'm guessing this is starting to make sense now to some people, but once you're done, it will make so much sense. All right, so we have bin. Then I bring in at conditional. Then I bring in my Linux condition.class. All right, you see this basically works. So if this is so, then this will run. I'll say, hey, I'm running on Linux. All right, so let's make this a bit robust. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create another conditional. And I'm gonna call it Mac condition because I'm basically using a Mac, right? I'm using Mac. All right, so Mac condition, and I'm gonna change this to Mac. So the lowercase that contains Mac. So let's make it lowercase. So everything lowercase. So yeah, so it's basically gonna have. So it's gonna be Linux. All right, so Linux, Mac. All right, so then let's create for this guy. I call it Mac conditional class. Call it Mac bin, and running on Mac. All right, so that basically clears things up. Let's see, everything looks good so far. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. So what it will do is that it will actually evaluate this condition, and check. It will get the system property and check if the OS is basically Linux, then we can be sure that this is going to come on. If it is Mac, this is going to come on. This is super useful, right? This is super useful. In the case of, you could have a property in the system, right? Let's say you have an application that is deployed in several places, right? Some is totally tailored towards the mobile app, some totally towards the web app, such that you don't want the two interactions, right? You don't want the two interactions to be in the same app, right? Instead of scaling up, I've seen several companies actually take the application and port it and place, or should I say, and place it for different environments, so that it doesn't actually conflict. So you're sure that, okay, all the instances of this application is running from for the mobile, all this is actually running for the web. So you can have a property, right, which I'm going to show you in the next part. You can have a property that will then basically say, okay, if it's running on app, it should bring up this instance. If you're running on mobile, bring up this instance. If you're running on web, bring up this instance. So you could have a custom logic to do that. So you can imagine what I can do with this. Say this will only run if it is Mac. If it's Linux, this will only run if it is Mac. Let's go further. Then you start to get the gist. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this application. All right, so this is started. Right, so let's see this beam. All right, did we find this? Let's check. Running on Linux. Nope, we don't have this. Let's check for Mac. Running on Mac, we don't have this. So let's check our Mac condition again. All right, so I'm gonna place this here. So let's debug it. Let's see what happened. I'm gonna go ahead and debug this. All right, so this is being debugged. All right, so you can see this contains Mac OS X, which is basically correct. So if I have this and I place it as a lowercase, right, so I can just debug using an expression here, OS dot to lowercase. All right, so I expect to have Mac OS X. Okay, so let's check our condition again. This is not true. This is lowercase and this contains. So let's evaluate this. Is this correct? So this returns a true. All right, so let's see why it is not printing. So let's go back in here. Let's go back into our Mac condition. This is Linux, this is Mac condition. And let's go to the app and let's see if it gets in here. All right, so you can see it basically gets in here. Now, it is not printing because apparently we did not print it. We just ran it already. So what I'm going to do, so let's do south. Then we're going to bring in, hey, running on Mac. All right, so let's print it out. So that would be better. All right, so let me restart this. So let me remove this. Let's run it without debug. I want to run it without debug mode. All right, so we should basically see this. So we're able to actually log that to see what is happening. So if I check this out, run this, as you can see, hey, running on Mac. So I hope this gives you a better idea. That's how add conditionals work, right? That's how conditionals work. Let's go on a bit deeper. Let's create a property. And this property here, let's basically call it a feature, payment, then enabled. I will set it to true. So in this case, what we're going to do is we'll create yet another, right? But this time around, we are going to be exploring the next one. And bean, just call it, I think I'll just do bean and tab. Yeah, tab will basically create it. Then we'll have something like a string. I have a string. Then I have I basically have let's call it payment service. So let's see if it's payment service. Payment service bean. All right, that works. Payment service bean. All right. Now this time around, I'm gonna say at conditional on property. At conditional on property. So at conditional property is saying if this property is available and it has this value, do this, right? Set up this bin. If not, don't set up this bin. And I'm going to just mention the case where this is going to happen. So I'm going to say the name basically is, I'll follow the feature, Remember feature, what did we call it again? Let's check. Feature payments enabled. So feature payments dot enabled. Then I want to ensure it has having value, and the value should be true. So the value should be true. If this is so, I'm gonna say do not copy, right? Copying is bad. So we'll say running payment service. I'm gonna say, hey, payment service booming. All right. Okay, so let's run this. All right, so if we check this out, let's see if we find this. Do control find. As you can see, payment service booming, which shows you that it actually catches this. Now, let's see what happens if we turn this to false. So if I turn this to false and I run this again, what would happen? All right. So if I do a control find, you can see it's not finding it, right? Because it shows only when this property is true does it actually work. Now, where does this work? Now, think about it. Say you have a service that can have two modes, right? That can have two modes. Let's say a typical case, you have a Google payment service and you have a Microsoft payment service, right? You have any of them. And you want to be able to change this. You only want one service to be up per time, right? You don't want both services to be up per time. So you could create a property to say, if Google, I can say Google payment service true or Microsoft payment service true. If one is true, if Google is true, Microsoft should be false. If Microsoft is true, Google should be false. So that way you could bring up the bean. Let's say you created a custom bean that does the main processing. This is exactly where it could work. I hope that actually captures the use case, guys. So the idea is not to show you something specific, but the idea is to be able to actually indoctrinate, to show you guys where you can basically apply this. So another common case, which I'm going to give you an example, another common case is when you have, let's say you're actually setting up Redis. Redis can take two forms. It could actually come in as a standalone or as Sentinel. Sentinel means you have a lot of Redis, you have a Redis cluster that contains maybe over one, or should I say 2, 3, 4, or more than should I say instances, right? And it's within a cluster, right? So it could be a case where your company has set up a cluster, but for some reason your cluster can fail. So you probably want to default to a Redis instance where you point a Redis standalone, where you point to one single instance. This would basically help you. So you could basically set on property to say if Redis cluster true, right? If you do this Redis cluster, you do your Redis cluster configuration. Then you have another one, so you could do something like this. So this could let's do this. So you could say is Redis cluster true. Let's call it Redis cluster bean. Redis cluster bean, and this you have Redis Sentinel. Just call it Redis Sentinel. I don't know if it's Sentinel or Sentinel. I think Sentinel. Okay, I'll just say running Sentinel. Then I will also have, if it is false, if this is having false, then I'll say Redis standalone. Redis standalone. I'll call it Redis standalone. So I'm sure I'm using a very common case because I'm sure you guys use Redis. Virtually all companies use Redis or something that looks like Redis, right? Maybe DynamoDB or Redis. So in this case, if I have this to be true, it will actually set up the Redis cluster. So that's the only bean. If it doesn't have it, then you have it. Most often time, you probably have something like maybe a connection factory here. Probably a connection factory, right? A connection factory of some sorts. So we don't have that now. So I can just go ahead. Let's just create something. Let's just call this factory. That basically does nothing. It shouldn't do anything. I'll just call it connection factory. Factory, not faction. Okay, connection factory. Right? And what we'll just do, just begin to give it a property, a string, just call it factory, right? factory name. Yeah, this is good. So just have factory name, and I'll just say, let me give it a getter. I'll just put a getter in here at getter. Basically, so say we have something like this. So what I can do, I can just come in here, my app, and just create the connection factory, right? So this connection factory basically is available. The same kind of connection factory, but it then tells me which, right? If it's Sentinel or if it is standalone. So I'm just going to expand this also. I'm going to do new connection factory, and just call it Sentinel, right? And I'll do the same thing here. Say new connection factory standalone. So let's run this. Okay, first of all, let's provide the property, because the property must be available. Let's provide the property. And I'm going to say Redis cluster is Redis cluster true. So let's see which one comes to be. I'm sure you're guessing it already. Did we update this? Yeah. So let's check this. Is this Sentinel? Let's confirm. As you can see, Sentinel is in play. Let's look for standalone. Is standalone available? No, standalone is not available. So let's go in and then swap this. Let's make this false. And let's run this. Let's check. You can see standalone is not available. What about cluster? No cluster is available. All right. I hope this basically gives you the idea. You understand how conditionals work, how you can basically apply it into your coding practice, right? So this is a feature in Spring that is pretty useful, right? Which you can use over and over again. All right. So let's quickly take one more. Let's take one more for this video. And let's call it, we're going to do, let's see now. Let's use @bean. So let's look at @bean. I have several ones. I'm trying to see which one would be shorter because of time constraint. I don't want to exceed 220 minutes in this video. All right, let's look at this. Okay, so I have a note I'm basically following. All right, so let's start off this, then we'll complete it in the next video. All right, so we'll have @bean, then let's release our connection factory, since we're already using this, right? Connection factory, right? So we have this, and let's see, we might have two, so let's call it connection factory 2, because it will basically flag it if they're the same bean and they are no different names. Okay, let's just call it for the connection factory bean, and let's just add it at conditional. So there are two types of this at conditional on bean, meaning if this bean is present, introduce this bean, right? So if this particular bean is present, it says introduce this bean. Then we have another called bean missing. If missing, that's a bean missing bean. So there's missing bean, meaning introduce this bean only when this one is actually not available. So this one says introduce this bean when this is available. This one says introduce this bean only when this is missing. And a typical use case for this, I'll just quickly mention. A typical use case could be if you don't, like, take for Hikari, right? That's a connection manager, right? For the data source. Now, in this case, if you don't set anything, let's say you connect to MySQL, right? And you don't provide any known configuration, and don't label it as a primary, we'll probably get to that in another video. If you don't do that, there is already a set of data source that will be auto-configured for you. That is what actually works. You'll probably see something like if a bean, it checks if the data source is available. If it's available, it actually injects it. So that is a typical use case. All right, I hope this video has been very satisfactory. I'll see you guys in the next video where we basically complete this. With that being said, see you guys in the next video.